Alright, let's dive deep into an important concept that can significantly boost your car's score: finding the missing pieces to the puzzle in Cars Passages. Now, I know tackling cars can feel overwhelming, but you don't have to be a superhuman reader to score well. The truth is, your intuition is more powerful than you think. Sometimes, while you're reading, you may sense that something's not quite right. Something feels incomplete in the argument. It's like the author has left a piece of the puzzle missing, either in the premises or the evidence. In this video, we'll talk about how to identify these gaps and understand how they can show up in different types of Cars questions. So let's get started. Why finding the missing pieces matters. Every Cars passage is an argument, and every argument is built on a foundation of premises and evidence. When there's a gap in that foundation, something that's implied but not stated explicitly, we call it an unstated premise or an implied warrant. Being able to recognize these missing pieces can help you answer specific inference questions where you're asked to identify assumptions or evaluate the strength of the argument. Now, let's break down two main types of reasoning you'll encounter and how missing pieces come into play: deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Understanding deductive reasoning. Let's start with the basics of deductive reasoning. In a deductive argument, the conclusion is considered true if the premises are true. The simplest form of deductive reasoning is called a syllogism, which involves two premises leading to a conclusion. For example, all mammals breathe air. 2. A dolphin is a mammal. 3. Therefore, a dolphin breathes air. Here, if both premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. The reasoning is airtight. What is an enthymeme? However, things get trickier with enthymemes, which are like syllogisms, but with an unstated premise. Let's look at an example. John will get wet because he forgot his umbrella. The unstated premise here is, it's raining. The argument implies it's raining without stating it outright. In Cars passages, you'll often encounter arguments that are enthymemes, where the author expects you to fill in the missing piece. You need to be able to spot these gaps and understand how they affect the argument. Let's walk through a few examples. Examples of enthymemes: she must be exhausted because she worked late. Unstated premise: working late makes people exhausted. You should try this diet because it worked for my friend. Unstated premise: if a diet works for one person, it will work for others. Understanding these missing premises can help you answer questions where the test writer asks you to supply what's implied. Sometimes, you'll even get a question that asks what would happen if the unstated premise wasn't true. For example, what if working late doesn't always make people exhausted? This type of question tests your ability to recognize the argument's assumptions. Moving on to inductive reasoning, evidence, and warrants. Now, let's discuss inductive reasoning, where you draw conclusions based on evidence. In these cases, the conclusion is supported by evidence but is not guaranteed to be true. For example, Sarah has a fever, so she must be sick. Here, the evidence is Sarah's fever, and the conclusion is that she's sick. But there's a catch. The evidence doesn't guarantee the conclusion. There could be other reasons for Sarah's fever, like physical exertion or an allergic reaction. This brings us to the concept of the warrant. What is a warrant? In an inductive argument, the warrant is the link that connects the evidence to the claim. It answers the question, why does this evidence support the conclusion? In our example, the warrant would be, fever is a common symptom of illness. Sometimes, the warrant is not explicitly stated, making it an implied warrant. When answering Cars questions, you might be asked to identify or evaluate the strength of these implied warrants. Examples of implied warrants in everyday situations. He must be a great chef because he owns a restaurant. Warrant: owning a restaurant means you can cook well. Not necessarily true. This athlete is the best because he's won the most championships. Warrant: winning championships is the best measure of an athlete's skill. Understanding these implied warrants can help you answer Cars questions that deal with assumptions or the validity of evidence. How to spot missing premises and implied warrants. While reading now that you know what missing premises and implied warrants are, how do you spot them in a Cars passage? Pay attention to gaps in logic. If you come across a statement that feels like it's jumping to a conclusion without enough support, pause and ask yourself, what's missing here? The missing piece might be an unstated premise or an implied warrant. Look for qualifiers or absolutes. Statements with words like always, never, or must often have implied warrants. For example, anyone who skips breakfast will be less productive. The warrant here is that breakfast is necessary for productivity. Practice reading critically. When you sense that something feels off in the argument, take a moment to identify what's being assumed. Ask yourself, is the evidence actually supporting the claim, or is there an underlying assumption? How this relates to CARS question types. Let's talk about how these concepts show up in different types of CARS questions. Understanding missing premises and implied warrants will especially help you with specific inference questions. These questions often ask you to infer something not explicitly stated in the passage, such as an unstated premise or implied warrant. Weaken or strengthen questions. If the question asks you to evaluate the strength of an argument, knowing the implied warrant helps you judge whether a piece of evidence actually supports the claim. Assumption questions. These directly test your ability to identify what the argument is taking for granted. Recognizing unstated premises will give you a significant advantage here. Examples of CARS questions testing missing premises and implied warrants. Question example. The author claims that increased regulations will harm the economy. What assumption does the author make in this claim? Here, you would identify the unstated premise, such as regulations typically lead to economic downturns. Question example 2. If new evidence showed that traffic cameras do not reduce speeding incidents, how would this affect the author's argument? In this case, the question is challenging the implied warrant that traffic cameras are effective in reducing speeding. Practice. Applying what you've learned. Let's work through a quick example together. Imagine a CARS passage says, recent studies show that students who take gap years tend to perform better in college. Therefore, taking a gap year is beneficial for all students. What's the unstated premise here? It's the assumption that performance in college is the only measure of benefit. Identifying this missing piece helps you critically evaluate the argument and anticipate possible CARS questions related to it. The role of Toulmin's argument model. If you're familiar with Toulmin's model, you'll know it consists of three main parts: claim, evidence, and warrant. Think of Toulmin's model as a way to mentally map out arguments in CARS passages. Claim. What is the author trying to convince you of? Evidence. What facts or data are used to support the claim? Warrant. What's the underlying assumption that connects the evidence to the claim? Keeping this model in mind while reading can help you spot gaps in the argument and better anticipate what the questions will focus on. Wrapping it up. So, let's sum it up. 1. Be on the lookout for missing premises and implied warrants while reading. This helps you identify weak points in the argument that might show up in the questions. Understand the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning involves syllogisms and enthymemes, while inductive reasoning involves evidence and warrants. 3. Use Toulmin's model as a mental framework for breaking down arguments into claim, evidence, and warrant. This will help you evaluate the strength of the argument more effectively. 4. Practice regularly with CARS passages to get better at spotting these missing pieces. Remember, you don't need to catch every missing premise or implied warrant on the first read. The goal is to keep moving forward with a sense of flow and engagement. When the questions come, you'll be better prepared to tackle them. If you found this helpful, download the King of the Curve app or visit kingoffthecurve.org. We offer over 200 free CARS passages to help you sharpen your skills and score higher on the MCAT. Let's keep practicing and get closer to that top score together.